A very good evening to all present here. I'm Ghazi Hassan, Senior Research Associate, Center for Strategic Studies. I will be the host for today's 17th quarterly lecture organized by Center for Public Policy Research. CPPR is an independent public policy organization dedicated to in-depth research and scientific analysis with the objective of delivering actionable ideas that could transform the society. Based out of Kochi in the Indian state of Kerala, our engagement in public policy that began in 2004 has initiated opened dialogue, policy changes, and institutional transformation in the areas of urban reforms, livelihood, education, health, governance, international relations, and security. It was in 2012, in November, CPPR initiated the quarterly lecture series in Cochin to make the public aware of various socially relevant themes. So far, we have wonderful experience of organizing the lecture series featuring eminent speakers like Dr. Alexander Lennon, Professor Madhav Gadgil, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Dr. Sandeep Shastri, Dr. Sanjay Baru, among others. The response to the quarterly lecture series has been wonderful. By organizing the lecture series, CPPR aims at spreading awareness besides presenting innovative ideas for opening up the intellectual realm of Kerala. The topic for today's quarterly lecture is India and its neighborhood. And to get a better understanding of the issue, CPPR is fortunate to have our distinguished speaker, Dr. TCA Raghavan. Dr. Raghavan retired from Indian Foreign Services in December 2015, while India's High Commissioner to Pakistan. He had earlier served as Deputy High Commissioner to Pakistan and High Commissioner to Singapore. During his last posting in New Delhi in the Ministry of External Affairs, Dr. Raghavan was Joint Secretary dealing with Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. He has also served in Kuwait, United Kingdoms, and Bhutan. Posts earlier held in the Ministry of External Affairs include Director of the Office of External Affairs, Ministry. Dr. Raghavan is currently the Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs, New Delhi. ICWA and CPPR has signed an MOU on June 18, 2020. As per the MOU, both the organizations are to undertake joint studies on topics of common interest and promote the exchange of information through the joint publication. On behalf of CPPR, we extend a very warm welcome to Dr. TCA Raghavan to the 17th quarterly lecture. Before we dwell into the proceedings of quarterly lecture, there is one announcement we want to make. CPPR has a learning, training, and development vertical, CPPR Academy, which has been functioning from last 8 years. To keep pace with the changing time, we are ready to take Academy online. Dr. Raghavan has graciously accepted our request to formally launch the CPPR Online Academy. I request sir to kindly inaugurate the same.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Firstly, I hope I'm audible, and I'm very happy to be part of this launch of the Center for Public Policy Research Online Academy, and I'm sure it will reach out to even larger number of interested participants. I think public policy is an area where the greater attention there is in all parts of the country, the better it is for all of us. So I'm very happy that the CPPR has taken this initiative, and I'm delighted to be part of the inaugural or launch ceremony. May I again congratulate all of those involved in putting together this online platform so as to reach out to a wider section of our citizens and enlarge the fraternity which debates, discusses, and participates actively on the full range of public policy issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for inaugurating the Academy. Without further ado, I request you to deliver CPPR 17th quarterly lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you. May I begin by thanking the Center for Public Policy Research for this invitation to interact with all of you. I look forward greatly to the opportunity. This is an opportune time for discussing our neighborhood, but I would begin with a more general consideration that it is how important it is that we discuss foreign policy related issues in as wide a platform as is possible. Uh, I think the most important point to remember while discussing the external policy or foreign policy of any country is that it is a policy which has to be made in different parts of the country and not just limited to the Ministry of External Affairs or to the national capital. By its very nature, for a country like India, given its geographical spread and the range of issues that we confront today, uh, foreign policy has to involve a much wider enterprise than just intergovernmental or intragovernmental consultations, or for it to be limited to the foreign policy fraternity which exists in the national capital. Therefore, I'm very happy to have a chance to interact with you today, although it is a virtual interaction. Nevertheless, I presume that this opportunity to interact with an institution based in Kochi will be of great benefit, at least to me. Uh, Discussions with a largely Kerala-based audience have their own importance and flavor. And that is because of the important role which scholars and public figures from Kerala have played in the conceptualization of Indian foreign policy. Two persons, and there are many more, but two persons immediately come to mind. Firstly, Krishna Menon, and we are fortunate that we have had a very fine biography of Krishna Menon in recent months by Shri Jairam Ramesh. But the other person who comes to mind is K.M. Panikkar, and I mention K.M. Panikkar because the Indian Council of World Affairs is organizing a seminar on one aspect of K.M. Panikkar, which is his role in contributing to our maritime thinking. But K.M. Panikkar, Sardar Panikkar, was a man of many parts, and his achievements in different fields are really quite impressive. He was, of course, a historian and a scholar, and his contributions both to history writing as equally to Malayalam literature are considerable. But he was also someone who understood princely states, princely India, very, very acutely. And that aspect too of his life is extremely important. And there are other aspects also, his role in the States Reorganization Commission, his role as a diplomat, and finally, of course, through his writings, the manner in which he conceptualized a maritime consciousness for independent India. That is what the seminar which the ICWA is proposing to have will be about. But I thought I should mention how very grateful I am to the CPPR for having inviting me to interact with an audience which we all know in the rest of the country is very, very deeply engaged with all foreign policy issues. When we talk about our neighborhood, the first question which obviously comes up is of definition. And there are many definitions. One which used to be quoted a great deal in the past, but we don't hear it so often, was something which Viceroy Curzon had said, that India's neighborhood extends from Aden to the Straits of Malacca. I think without going into the question of definition, if we follow the spread of our national interests, what is very clear is that our neighborhood comprises two broad dimensions, which is the continental and the maritime. Now, neither of these two dimensions requires any great explanation, but uh, this conceptual understanding is important because it takes you into a realm which thinks beyond national boundaries of each of our neighbors, but to a more fundamental way of looking at, as I said, the footprint of our and the spread of our national interests. This is obviously an opportune time for discussing our neighborhood. We are in the midst of a major global pandemic, and it is by no means clear how long this pandemic is going to continue. It is also by no means clear what will be the final economic, social, and political cost which this pandemic will inflict. But this pandemic also is a reflection of other forces, and sometimes a pandemic enables us to concentrate more on the realities which it has revealed. Like any crisis, a crisis is an event which shows up reality as it exists with greater clarity. And certainly, when we look at the geopolitical churn which we are in the midst of, it does provide a point of entry for discussing our neighborhood. As I said, this is an opportune time for discussing our neighborhood because we're in the midst of a very, very difficult situation with China on our north. The situation in Ladakh means that India-China relations have entered into a zone where we certainly did not want them to go. This situation with China on our northern borders coincides with a more general questioning of China's behaviors and intentions, but also at the same time there is a stronger consolidation of countries around China and in support of China. So this is one very important element of the geopolitical churn which we are in the midst of. In the north also, we have had difficulties with another important neighbor, landlocked as it is, Nepal. On our west, there are continuing frictions and tensions with Pakistan. There is an effort, of course, by Pakistan to show the current situation as an outcome of the legislative changes which took place in J&K in August 2019. But in fact, even a moment's reflection will show that the current with Pakistan is in fact part of a much older pattern. India-Pakistan relations shows certain endemic or structural issues to which there is no easy answer, and certainly that comprises another very important element of our neighborhood challenges. There are similarly to our west, there are looming uncertainties in Afghanistan. Clearly, one phase of Afghanistan's history, which began around the turn of the century, is now coming to an end. And what the next phase will reveal, we have to wait and see. There are uncertainties also in Iran, again to our west, and these are primarily to do with US-Iran relations, but the implications and the impact of the breakdown in US-Iran relations, that has been a long breakdown in US-Iran relations, but the impact of that on India also is an important factor. But as I said, our neighborhood has a second dimension apart from the continental, which is the maritime. And when we look at the maritime dimension, we look at Sri Lanka, we look at Maldives, and we look also at Bangladesh and Myanmar. And both of them, although we have long borders with both Bangladesh and Myanmar, they are also very important maritime neighbors of India. Now, each of these countries, China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, perhaps merits a lecture in themselves. I don't intend to go into details of any particular aspect of our bilateral relations, unless, of course, the subject comes up in the course of my talk. But I want to look at neighborhood issues in a more conceptual framework in terms of an overview. And from time to time, I'll refer to specific countries, at least those with which I'm more familiar. But I wish to begin with my first general proposition that however much we may think our neighborhood is a self-contained space, in fact, it is not, and it has never been. We are today in a situation of a geopolitical churn, very clearly because of the fact that the process of the consolidation of a new power is now consolidating. We have a situation today where, in the form of China, there is a second hegemon, a global hegemon, very, very clearly visible on the skyline. But the fact is that these situations in international affairs, if one looks at a wider span of history, have always been there. If we go back some 30 odd years, just like we confront today a situation of a new power rising on the horizon, at that time we were confronted with a global power fading or declining or disintegrating. And that too was a process of very great impact on us and on our neighborhood. If one looks at the period 1989, 1990, 1991, 1992, in fact, we see many similarities with the situation that we have today, which is not to say that the situations are identical. They are by no means identical because the overall context has changed. But it was a situation, it was a time when we had, if one looks at 1989, 1990, you see the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, raising a number of issues for India and South Asia. 1989 was also the year in which the Berlin Wall came down. It was the year, most importantly for us, towards the end of 1989, we saw the beginnings of an insurgency in Kashmir. It was also a very difficult year for India, 1988, 1989, 1990, in terms of our policy towards Sri Lanka, as indeed our policy towards Nepal. So you find a similar set of neighborhood situations that we faced at that time, and with one big difference in the overall context, that 1989 and the early 1990s was a period when a superpower was declining or was disintegrating in the form of the Soviet Union. New cartographic realities were emerging with the coming down of the Berlin Wall. While today we are facing a situation where we have the rise of a new global power and a new global hegemon in the form of China, and that, of course, is a critical factor in the global churn that we are in the midst of. So the first general thought I would leave with you is that our neighborhood is very much part of a wider regional and international framework, whatever happens over there has a great impact on each of our bilateral uh, relations with our immediate neighbors. The second point I wish to emphasize pertains to our maritime neighborhood, and particularly the contrast between uh, the maritime neighborhood to our east and the maritime neighborhood to our west. And this is really the contrast between the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal littorals. If one looks at the Arabian Sea littoral, we find in it a situation of very great stress and conflict. Uh, you have Yemen, you have the Gulf states, and all the intra Gulf problems, as also the problems between the Gulf states and Iran. You have Pakistan, and you have the whole range of the issues thrown up by the dynamics of the Makran coast, whether in the form of Chabahar or in the form of Gwadar. So the Arabian Sea littoral is, on the whole, a littoral of very great stress, number of competing and contesting forces, a whole range of unresolved historical uh, issues. Now, the contrast is with the Bay of Bengal littoral, where you find, on the whole, an environment in which there is a much greater there is a much greater spread of regional cooperation and interstate cooperation. The most striking example of that, of course, is ASEAN and the different mechanisms which ASEAN has consolidated. But there is also BIMSTEC and the kind of regional cooperation that it is fostering. My simple point is that this contrast between our eastern and western maritime flanks is something which we should always keep in mind and try to see what we can do to address the challenges that the kind of regional cooperative mechanisms which do not exist in the Arabian Sea littoral, how we can try to develop them. I think we have made some very major advances with regard to developing cooperative mechanisms in the Arabian Sea littoral by the strengthening which has taken place in recent months and years in our relations with the states, especially Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, and others. This is a positive development, but at the same time, the overall contrast still remains between the Arabian Sea littoral and the Bay of Bengal littoral. I don't need to emphasize to an audience in Kerala the importance of the Arabian Sea littoral for India in terms of very, very direct national interest. Our dependence in terms of employment on on the Persian Gulf, on the Gulf states, our hydrocarbon dependence on them are well known. The impact of the pandemic on these economies is still, as I said, not very certain as to what will be the full long-term impacts. So a situation of conflict in the Arabian Sea littoral is something which is fundamentally against our interests, and to the extent that we can try to reduce the possibilities of that conflict, the better it is for our long-term national interests. The third point I wish to make when we talk about our neighborhood is with regard to cooperation within South Asia itself. And here I would like to touch very briefly on SAARC and the narrative value which SAARC has, notwithstanding the fact that its effectiveness as a regional cooperation mechanism has been somewhat limited. I think we should not underestimate the narrative value of SAARC, and it is something which we need to do, which we need to keep in mind to see to what extent we will be able to revive it in the future. I think it is also important that when we talk about India and its neighborhood, we also introspect and think about the contrast between ASEAN and SAARC. That why is it that ASEAN has been so much more effective while SAARC has not? Now, to some extent, the reasons are obvious, that at no stage did the ASEAN or Southeast Asia have a situation like that, have a situation or that led to challenges of the kind which have been posed by Pakistan with regard to India, or Pakistan with regard to Afghanistan, and so on. Nevertheless, this overall contrast between ASEAN and SAARC is something which is worth keeping in view, particularly in the context of this broader contrast between the Bay of Bengal littoral and the Arabian Sea littoral. The next point which strikes me when we talk about our neighborhood today is something which I have referred to, and something which is constantly under discussion, not just in India, but possibly in every country around the world, which is China. Now, the emergence of the consolidation of China on the process of becoming a great power, setting itself up, claiming to be a global hegemon, poses certain fundamental conceptual issues for India and its neighborhood. If one looks at Indian policy, our foreign policy towards our neighbors, it was traditionally always underwritten by the view that to the extent we can keep great powers out of our immediate neighborhood, the better it is for us and the better it is for our neighbors. Now, we were not always successful in following this template. Certainly with a neighbor like Pakistan, we never had the opportunity or the possibility never existed of keeping great powers out of Pakistan, because it was a part of Pakistan policy to try to bring great powers in so as to balance India. It did so first with the United States, and now increasingly with China. But notwithstanding the contrarian example of Pakistan, the fact is that our general approach was that we should try to keep great powers out of our immediate environment, and that is in the interest both of our neighbors as also of ourselves. Along with this was, again, an unwritten, but nevertheless, there was this feeling that our own constitutional values and our own constitutional template was possibly something which could be applied to our neighbors also. Now, I could speak on this at some length, but my general point is that approach towards our neighbors now has to change, because it is no longer a question of keeping great powers out of our neighborhood. We have a situation where we have a great power in our midst, or at least in close proximity to us. So the China factor is something which we need to spend much more time thinking about when we deal with our neighbors. And inevitably that means that we have to look at our neighbors through fresh eyes, and the older approach that you keep powers out may not be possibly the only approach now to be followed, because uh, the emergence of China as an economic power, and more than an economic power, the emergence of China as a narrative power, I think poses fundamental issues for how we should approach each of our neighborhood relationships. Uh, the What do I mean by that? I think the spectacular Chinese economic performance in the last 2 or 3 decades, and the capacity to raise a very large number of people from conditions of near poverty to near middle class status, has raised the bar for each of our neighbors, as indeed it has for India. And in the context of the pandemic that we are all facing today, I think we need to also think much more deeply about how we increase public access to different services in India, how we increase investments in health, literacy, infrastructure, and so on. This is something which we should be doing in the normal course, but I think in strategic terms, these are the questions which China poses for us in our immediate neighborhood. This really brings me to my next point, which is about the importance of thinking, especially when we think about our neighbors and our neighborhood. We have to think also in non-security terms. Now, it is an obvious fact, it is a given that strategic realities will not change, and geopolitics, traditional geopolitics and strategic issues will inevitably form a very large part of our foreign policy mindset. But I think what the pandemic has told us is that alongside this large chunk of our mental space, I'm audible now, I hope.
Yes, sir, you're audible.
So, as I was saying, I think we need to think much more seriously about non-security issues and bring them much closer to the center of our radar than traditional geopolitical or strategic thinking permits. Uh, this question of infrastructure, literacy, public health have always been central questions, but they have been posed with a directness today which we can no longer ignore. And while this applies, of course, to domestic policy, it should also apply with equal force to foreign policy, and especially when we look at neighborhood neighborhood policy. So, how we de-securitize our narratives and our approaches, even while accepting that the traditional security and geopolitical issues will always be a central component of foreign policy, especially with regard to our neighborhood. But how we de-securitize it to some extent, I think, is a major challenge for us, and something which we have to think very, very deeply, about. Let me give you one example with regard to a country with which I have somewhat more familiar than some of our other neighbors, which is Pakistan. Now, the entire history of India-Pakistan relations need not be recounted, but it would be a fair summary to say that it has largely been a history of strategic mistrust and fundamental differences on issues of identity, territory, and so on. So it has largely been a security-driven relationship. which is not to say that efforts to desecuritize it have not existed. I think there have been three major efforts over the past half century to desecuritize India-Pakistan relations. Out of the three, one succeeded to some extent, and two have been failures. Uh, the success was in the case of the Indus Waters river sharing regime. The two failures were in the case of trade, and secondly, in the case of the Iran-Pakistan-India gas pipeline. Uh, I don't want to go into the details of each of these efforts, but the point is that these were efforts to desecuritize a highly securitized relationship. There were, of course, other efforts also, which were less visible, which were most of the time below the radar. But these were the three major efforts to desecuritize the relationship. And as I said, one succeeded, two did not. I think while the factors which led to the failures are well known, and there are certain lessons to be drawn from each of those factors. But the fact is that for a country, we cannot proceed with our neighborhood, even with a neighbor like Pakistan, on the presumption that the only way of dealing with it is within a security paradigm. Now, obviously, this approach of a desecuritized relationship will be fanciful if we do not relate it to existing realities. And there are obvious challenges when it comes to Pakistan, given the issues of terrorism, the use of non-state actors, etc. But with our other neighbors, I think this desecuritization is something which we have to build into our neighborhood approach. To a great extent, I think in the actual working of government policy, it is being done. But the narrative value, the narrative impact of it is somehow not there. And that has a lot to do less with government policy, more with the thinking about our neighborhood, which exists in the foreign policy and strategic fraternity. I think we have to approach our neighbors, as I said, with much greater sensitivity, taking into account the kind of issues which they have and the kind of domestic challenges which they face. And these are quite frankly not that foreign to us, because many of the issues which our neighbors face are similar to the issues our own citizens face. And which really brings me to my point about how we think about our neighborhood in terms of improving infrastructure, improving public access to literacy, to health, public health, education, and so on. And I think if we form that as the basis of our neighborhood narratives, it would mean certainly some improvement in the way we conduct our foreign policy with regard to our neighbors. Now, there is a great deal which can be said about this. There are obvious, as I said, one cannot proceed on this basis without taking into account existing realities. But how we bring non-security more centrally into the radar of our neighborhood policy is, I think, the real issue which we will face as we proceed further. With these remarks, I'd like to again thank the Center for Public Policy Research for inviting me to discuss our neighborhood. I'm sure questions, and I consciously didn't go into many specific issues concerning Pakistan or China, because many of these are much better taken on in a discussion format rather than in a monologue. So thank you very much again for inviting me.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful talk. We have a lot of questions, sir. There is a question from Dr. Lawrence Prabhakar, advisor CPPR. Sir, the question is, how would you envisage a maritime mandala for India's neighborhood in terms of eliciting the terms and of amenity and adversity in India's transaction in its foreign and strategic thinking over the years?
Well, it's a very interesting point, but before we think in terms of a maritime mandala, I think we need to do much more uh, deep thinking about uh, India itself as a maritime entity. One very important development, to my mind, which took place, I don't know how much it was noticed, was that last year, for the first time, a union department of fisheries came into existence. What was hitherto just a division in the Ministry of Agriculture and Animal Husbandry became a separate department at the in the union government. It's a very important development. But the fact that it took so long for it to happen suggests that maritime thinking is still not a central part of our consciousness. I don't think many countries, when we talk about India and we talk about the location of India, I don't think we sufficiently take into account how much of a coastal nation we are, and how so much of our history and geopolitics is really related to the seas and the oceans. As I mentioned, I think the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea are central to Indian geopolitics. And while it is true that our continental concerns will always have a more pressing dimension, because time on a continental scale moves much faster than it moves on the maritime scale. But I do feel that thinking more about our maritime issues is really central to how we go forward. I don't know whether we can call it a maritime mandala as yet. I think we need to much more, and certainly policies such as Sagar and so on are exactly what is required, but we need to do much more on that before we can go around talking in terms of a maritime mandala.
Okay, sir, there's a question from Professor R.P. Pradhan, BITS Planning. 2025 or 2030, where does India stand in the global power order and in the international distribution of leadership?
Well, I'm sure there'll be as many answers to that as there are people in India. A lot depends on where you stand globally in terms of where do you stand in your self-image. And I think global power is not a very objective. It's not a quantitative scale. It has a lot to do with the self-esteem of the power concerned, and you can look at the contrasting examples of China and the United States to get a sense of what I'm trying to say. The United States today is possibly more polarized than it has been for a very long time. Certainly since more polarized today than at any time since the 1970s. On an objective scale, in terms of the military power it has, in terms of its capacity for innovation, for scientific knowledge, in terms of being a destination for those who are going to produce more knowledge in the future, I don't think the United States has slipped. But certainly in terms of its own internal self-esteem, it has. In China, on the other hand, you have a country which seems to be informed by its self-esteem that in the space of 30 or 40 years, it has it has taken maybe 500, 600, 700 million people from near poverty levels to possibly middle class status by investing in public health, by investing in infrastructure, by investing in education. Now they did so with at enormous cost, and possibly in many ways, if one looks at what happened during the Great Leap Forward, during the Cultural Revolution, possibly they did so in a wasteful manner, and they could do so because of the kind of government system they have. But uh, uh, Chinese behavior today is informed by the fact that it could accomplish this major domestic transformation, and that has uplifted its self esteem enormously. So I think where India will stand 5 years or 10 years from now will depend a lot on how we in India see ourselves. Do we see ourselves progressing in the direction we want to go? Do we see ourselves uh, achieving quantitative leaps in our own standards of living? So I think it will be based on considerations of those kind rather than on any abstract notions of how global power is distributed.
Thank you, sir. So there's a question from KV Thomas, sir. They are saying that he's asking how effective is the regional cooperation between, cooperation bodies like ASEAN effective in safeguarding the foreign policy and the domestic priorities of our country in changing the global order, especially with the emergence of China in the international sphere. Whether the bilateral or the multilateral moves like Act East policy are more helpful for our country in the present context.
Well, I think if I understand the question correctly, I think uh, the fact that China is developing very strong relationships with other countries in Asia, including in Southeast Asia with ASEAN and so on. For me, the obvious implication for India is that we should be investing even more with those countries. I think the example of China means that we have to do more, not less. And when we look at our own neighborhood, yes, it is true there will be problems, but the nature of all neighborhoods is that there are more problems within than there are outside, because you can look at each of our neighborhood relationships in an international context, and then you will realize that there's nothing particularly unique about poor relations between India and Pakistan. Uh, Relations between neighboring countries are often very, very difficult. And if you're looking at India and Pakistan, you can look at Israel and some of its Arab neighbors. You can look at North Korea and South Korea. And you will realize that if one looks at it in this global sense, the takeaway is that neighborhood relationships are difficult. We have to therefore pay much more attention to them and not condemn any particular relationship as having a certain essentialist character which cannot be changed. I think the challenge for diplomacy is how do you try to improve what is already a bad relationship, rather than say that that relationship has no redeeming features at all and there's nothing to be done with it. So I think when we look at China and East Asia and Southeast Asia, that is the important takeaway for us. How we can improve our relations, how we can develop our relationships with each of those countries.
Thank you, sir. So there's a question from Dr. Vijay Sakuja. Do you think India is playing a maritime role in the 21st century that is similar to the ancient times? That is there a continuity but change?
Well, I find it difficult to answer that question because, when we are talking about ancient times, we're talking about a different context. A framework such as India did not exist in ancient times. It is a modern framework. Yes, in the first millennium, uh, possibly uh, what we could call India today had much closer links with Southeast Asia than possibly we have even today. But that was a totally different context. Those links in Southeast Asia, in the even in more in remoter parts of the Pacific, all the way to Indochina, were not the outcome of national policy. It was not the outcome of strategic thinking as we know it today. It was the outcome of other factors. It was the outcome of possibly uh, 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 commercial enterprise, the outcome of individuals, highly skilled, highly gifted, highly motivated, going out on their own and establishing a following in faraway Indochina or in some of the Pacific islands. I think the context today is of the application of mind to external policy. I mean, this is the big difference between the modern age and the ancient period that you're referring to when we talk about our maritime links. And I think that has a lot to do with how states think about maritime issues. And I think in India, there is much more thinking about the maritime than, for instance, there was 40 years ago. But there is a great deal more to be done, which will always bring us to the question of glass half empty or half full. But I think maritime issues now form a much larger part of the radar than they did possibly in the 60s and 70s. And that is a good development, but we certainly need to do much more about it.
Thank you, sir. So there's a question from Ajmal Farhan. He's asking, can you throw light upon the India's attitude towards Pakistan, and do you think the negligence towards Pakistan by India will pave way for more Chinese influence in Pakistan and will not increase the threat?
I disagree with the proposition that we have been negligent towards Pakistan. I think if you look at, let's say, the last quarter century, every government in India, regardless of its political or ideological color, has tried very hard with Pakistan. And if you look at, let's say, the prime ministers in the last 25 years, beginning with I.K. Gujral, Mr. Vajpayee, Dr. Manmohan Singh, Prime Minister Modi, you will find that all of them have tried quite hard with Pakistan. So it is not negligence which is the reason for the current India-Pakistan situation. I mean, if you look at the current government, it probably, and this is my assessment, it probably tried harder with Pakistan between 2014 and 2016-17 than any other government had done in the last 25 years. This is my assessment. The problem is you can try very hard, but the policy you may devise in the process a very good policy, but the policy may not work. I think this is the problem which we have faced with Pakistan, that a good set of measures which you thought would yield good results, but they did not work because everything which happens in Pakistan is not entirely in your hands. And there is the internal dynamic and an internal logic, and there is the weight of domestic developments in Pakistan, which has a bearing on external policy. And I think that is something which is not in your control. You may have the best policy in the world, but it still may not work. What does that mean? I think, to my way of thinking, what it means is that you have to try again, because in the end, as often said, you can change everything, but you can't change your neighbors. And set of problems you may have today, at the end of the day, you will have to go back to dealing with the same old neighbors and the same old neighborhood. So you have to keep trying. Uh, that is that is not something which is an option which you have to choose. That is something which is forced on you because of your particular location in South Asia, your own interests, and the size of your country, and the expectations which others have, that if you want to play a larger role in global affairs, you have to attend to your neighbors yourself.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So there's a question from Professor K.C. Abraham, Academic Director, CPPR. India is not in warm relationship with most of its neighbors. Has the big power syndrome affected this relationship?
Well, thank you, Professor. Very interesting question. Uh, my answer is that neighborhood relations are never easy. And I don't think there will ever be a situation we will ever have, quote unquote, warm relations with our neighbors. I think our relations with our neighbors will always be rocky. And this is in the nature of most neighboring country relationships. There's no easy way. There's no easy way to resolve neighboring country issues, because these are very complex issues to do with identity, history, unresolved conflicts, and so on. It's not simply a question that you throw science at the problem and a solution will emerge. Because if we look around the world, I mean, if you look at, for instance, Japan and South Korea, these are countries which trade a lot, they invest a great deal in each other. They have huge amounts of tourism in both directions, but they still have a relationship which is in the end friction ridden. Or you look at Japan and China, again, huge amount of trade and investment, lot of tourism. I mean, by all objective criteria, these should be neighbors which are getting along very well, but they are not. So I think there are certain fundamental peculiarities in neighboring country relationships, and these peculiarities are driven by issues of identity and of history. My short point is that we will never have a set of relations where you can say, okay, now there's nothing to be done. This relationship is at a even keel. A neighborhood requires constant attention and constant nurturing. And I think we have to be prepared for the downsides from time to time. But there is no real answer. But as I said, you can't change your neighbors to the table and work with them again.
Thank you, sir. So there's a question from Mr. Jackson Peter. What's our policy of narrative building across the world? We do not have a machinery to tell our national narratives abroad. Are we taking some measures to establish powerful global propaganda platforms to separate national foreign policy objectives?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not sure whether there is a immediate, straightforward answer to it, because I don't think building propaganda platforms really gives results which are commensurate with the investment or which has gone into them. I mean, you can look at, for example, the example of China. It invests a great deal on its image outside. But it is not as if the results it gets from it are commensurate, because the narratives about China in many parts of the world, not in all parts, but in many parts of the world, are quite negative. So yes, but there is a certain importance which has to be given to narrative building. I think one can do it most effectively if we if we do it in a way with which we are comfortable. I think India's narrative emerges from the strength of its democracy, from its plural society, the fact that so many languages, people of so many different speaking, so many different languages, so many different religions, so many different sociological backgrounds, different ethnicities, that you live together in a democracy. I think that is really the power of the Indian narrative, and that it has a history which goes back deep into our past adds to the power of that narrative. So I don't think we need to, make it into a bureaucratic program in terms of selling India abroad. But I think if we invest on these strengths, our democracy, our pluralism, and so on, I think that itself will strengthen an already strong narrative about India.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we have a question from a student from Madras Christian College, Pivesha. What are the major emerging global challenges for India currently?
I don't want to dodge the question, but if you let's say list India's challenges on a scale of 10, I would say 9 out of our 10 challenges, and if we can attend to those 9, there will really be no major global challenges for us. I think all our issues are internal, and if we can attend to them, we will be able to be much more at ease with our external environment. The aim of Indian foreign policy is not furthering our global interests. The aim of Indian foreign policy is how do we advance our domestic interests? How do we ensure greater development? How do we enable greater investment of resources into our domestic challenges? I think that is the aim of Indian foreign policy. I think to look at Indian foreign policy as a platform for expanding our global influence would be reordering. I mean, it is putting the cart before the horse. So I think the major challenge, I mean, in those terms, I would say that we have to secure our environment so that it is peaceful, our external environment, and that enables us to focus on our domestic issues. Now, do we have such an environment just now? No, because obviously you cannot focus to the extent you want on your domestic issues if you have an ongoing situation with China, if you have problems with Pakistan. So how we address those challenges is really the challenge for diplomacy, not as an end to it in itself. And I would repeat this. I don't think securing India's position in the global hierarchy is an end to it in itself. How we secure domestic development for our citizens, that is really the end.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we have a question from Vice Admiral Muralidharan. He's asking, can India play a significant role in strengthening the new relationship developing between Israel and some of the Gulf nations, and more so in non-security issues?
In my view, the Gulf countries, particularly UAE and so on, have in fact been much more proximate to Israel than the public postures would reveal. So while it may look that what is happening today is part of a larger reordering, that may well be so, but that what is happening today has fairly deep roots, and it is related to the fractures which emerged in both in the Arab world and particularly in the Gulf following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. I think in that sense, 90s was a fundamental inflection point for many of the Gulf states, perhaps all of them. And this more pragmatic approach to Israel followed from that, partly as a way of cementing ties with the United States, but partly uh, for its own uh, sake. So, do we have a role in developing that uh, those set of relationships? I don't know. I have no. My own view is that we have very good relations with Israel, and we have very good relations with the Gulf states, and we should try to keep both those sets of relationships as strong as possible. Will the fact that both these sets of countries have good relations with India may be a factor in their improving their own bilateral relationships. But as I said, I think but UAE-Israel relations or Saudi-Israel relations, whatever is happening, and we don't know much about it, I think they are driven by their own internal logic also.
Thank you, sir. So there's a question from Mr. Ramaya. Do you agree with the notion that the India-US relationship is currently thriving and will continue to progress? If so, what impact would this will have likely on India's relationship with its neighborhood? Similarly, how would India's responsibility and interest in the neighborhood impact India-US relationship?
Well, in my view, yes, it is true that India-US relations are presently very strong, and again, this is not a new thing, but certainly at the present state, there is a certain depth and quality to them, which is quite good, and perhaps would not have been expected even 10 years or 20 years ago. How does this impact our relations with our neighbors? It impacts it to some extent, but not unduly. I don't think our relations with Nepal or with Sri Lanka or with Bangladesh are impacted greatly by our relations with the United States. It is helpful because if you have good sets of relations with major powers, it is always uh, helpful. But I don't think it has a direct impact. I think where they do have a direct impact is in our relations with Pakistan. But that is more because of internal factors in Pakistan and uh, internal Pakistani uh, positions with regard to Afghanistan and the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and their own fears and suspicions about India. Uh, I think but I don't think there's a direct impact of the United States in the way that used to be there 20 or 30 years ago.
So there's a question from Mr. Chetan Kumar. Whether the present pandemic is helpful to boost the economy of a country, what is your opinion about this?
Well, the expectations are that there may be a reduction of global GDP by 7 to 10% as an immediate result of this pandemic. So I don't think the pandemic is helpful in an economic sense, and you only have to look around and see the enormous loss of economic value because of loss of employment, the closure of opportunities in a large part of our economy, which is the services sector. Maybe there are certain positive points which will emerge, because in the end, every crisis after a period of time shows up certain positive results too. But right now, it's difficult to see what are the plus points from this pandemic, because there is tremendous loss of employment. There is a huge impact on tourism, on the services sector, on entertainment, on the luxury travel, hotels, and so on. and all of which has an impact down the line. So it's difficult to see the positive aspects of this pandemic right now. Maybe later, 2, 3 years later, we'll be able to find some positive aspects. But right now, it appears to be somewhat strongly negative.
Thank you, sir. We have the last question. Ms. Pretty P. John asking that how much is the potential threat of string of pearls diplomacy of China in India's international sovereignty in its neighborhood? The threat of string of pearls.
You see, now, very clearly there is a Chinese maritime assertion taking place. Just like the Chinese in their economy, in their social sector, in their infrastructure, over the past 30 years, they have invested a great deal in their military and in particular in their navy. And that investment in its naval forces has also been accompanied by an investment in naval infrastructure, both in China as also elsewhere. Now, the latest phase of that is this Chinese maritime assertion into the Indian Ocean. So you have Gwadar, you have ports being developed in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, on the eastern coast of Africa, other islands. Now, is that a threat for us? Is that a problem for us? Yes, it is. But here I would like to, take you into a realm which is very important for those who study foreign policy to understand, which is we must accept the clear distinction which exists between the way a diplomat thinks and the way a military officer thinks. You see, the military mind is different from the diplomatic mind. The military mind is trained to look at capacities. The diplomatic mind is trained to look at intentions and policies. So when you show a naval officer the Chinese investments in its own maritime infrastructure and in naval facilities or port facilities in the east coast of Africa, in Seychelles, in Myanmar, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, they will draw only one lesson from it, which is that we are being encircled. Because the military mind thinks that intentions can change, but capacities remain constant. And if a country has a particular capacity, it may change its mind in the future about how it's going to use that capacity. So this is a threat, and we have to react to that threat. You see, a diplomatic approach or a political approach is slightly different. It doesn't mean that every capacity is a threat to you. Every capacity being built up is a threat against you, because then you would be constantly in a state of alert, if not in a state of war, whenever you see some capacity coming up. We also have to see this in terms of the natural growth of China. Because it has grown so much economically, it is going to grow externally also. Now, are either of these two approaches complete in themselves? No, they are not. Security thinking means that you combine both the military as also the diplomatic, and then take a more harmonized view of how you are going to frame your own policy. That is what national security thinking means, that you have two different approaches and you bring both together and then try to make a common harmonized approach out of all this. So yes, Chinese maritime assertion is taking place, but also it is true that the Chinese economy is growing. The Chinese foreign trade has grown enormously. China has developed huge economic linkages all over the world. So we cannot see purely in narrow terms of India being encircled by China. These are also the outcomes of the natural growth of a power when it starts exerting itself in its wider environment. So should we ignore these capacities? No, we should not. But should we go into a state where it means that we see everything which is happening in our neighborhood as a threat to us? Also, no. We have to combine both these approaches. And when you combine both these approaches, the answer you will come up with is that you have to do your own bit of heavy lifting and develop your own resources, make your own investments, develop your own navy, uh, invest in your economy, make it grow, make your GDP grow. So I think we have to look at these things in a more holistic way, taking into account, yes, the military perception of things, but also taking into account a wider perception.
Thank you so much, sir, for this insightful lecture. Now I request Dr. Lawrence Prabhakar, sir, advisor CPPR, to give his concluding remarks.
Uh, Thank the Lord God for this opportunity to do the concluding remarks of this very eloquent, elucidative lecture by Ambassador Dr. TCA Raghavan. Ambassador Dr. TCA Raghavan basically painted a very broad canvas of what constitutes foreign policy thinking. And he did so in very clear, succinct, strategic terms in looking at the wider ambit of foreign policy that should not only be in the national capital region, but could have its own provincialization throughout India. Because the entire crux of foreign policy making and foreign policy thinking is based upon what's called as a narrative-centric idea, whereby we find that ideas do mold foreign policy, and that was well elucidated by the ambassador. Ambassador also mentioned about the role of Ambassador Krishna Menon and Sardar K.M. Panika of Kerala's contribution in very quintessential terms to India's foreign policy making, more so in terms of Sardar Panika's maritime consciousness, which is now the flagship project of the ICWA. Ambassador basically made a very broad definition of what is called as the neighborhood from the Curzon paradigm, which he basically looked in from Aden to the Straits of Malacca, and that basically gives the maritimeness of India's foreign policy there. And Ambassador basically looked into the two axes of India's foreign policy, India's continental geopolitics and the maritime geopolitics, and he looked into the comparing, contrasting features between these two axes by which India was engaging the larger world ever since independence. And in the Ambassador also looked into terms of what we could call the relevance of the pandemic and how the pandemic had provided the transformative as well as the disruptive changes that has come into Indian foreign policy, and how the pandemic itself has provided a geopolitical turn, not only in India's neighborhood, but also in India's extended neighborhood there. Ambassador also looked into the single dominant factor of China, which is India's northeastern neighbor, and that as a vital, important catalyst of India's foreign policy thinking in the coming years. And I think he basically looked into the other peripheral aspects of Afghanistan, of Nepal, of Sri Lanka, of Maldives, and also he looked into how the neighborhood interacts with India and what are the consequent changes that has come into that. Basically, the ambassador had painted what we could call a regional security complex of the Arabian Sea littoral and Bay of Bengal littoral. The Arabian Sea littoral basically has its own stresses and challenges in terms of the near and the medium term perils that are coming from the region. And when he looked into the Bay of Bengal part of the maritime regional security complex, he basically painted the picture of what is called as the positive vibes of cooperation. And in that context, he looked into India's multiple interactions within India's maritime neighborhood of Mauritius, of what we could call as Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and then of course Myanmar. And that was basically within the context of what we could call as India's near neighborhood, by which he looked into that. Secondly, the ambassador also looked into the power of narratives in India's foreign policy and how narratives condition the neighborhood. Basically, his lecture is about neighborhood and narratives, which provided a very good cynosure of explaining how foreign policy trends could be there. He looked into the aspects of power transition, basically from the 1989 to 1992 power shift of what we could call the former Soviet Union with regard to the United States. And then he compared with the present context of the rise of China, and the US-China duopoly, which is in construction in terms of that. And very importantly, the maritime neighborhood was one of the centerpieces of the ambassador's well elucidated comparison between the maritime security complex of the Arabian Sea and the maritime security complex of what we could call as the Bay of Bengal. He compared and contrasted the impacts and convergences that these two regions had posed with each other. He emphasized the need of regional cooperation more in the Arabian Sea littoral, because that is somewhat what it could call as a weaker link of India's western seaboard. And having said that, the ambassador focused his attention on Southern Asia, on South Asia. He called in for greater security cooperation, and that greater security cooperation comes from the power of narratives of India's foreign policy, India's values. And he did a comparison between ASEAN and SAARC, and how ASEAN had prospered and how SAARC had been stalled for a variety of reasons there. Once again, focusing his attention on China, the ambassador did prescribe how great powers, from being kept away from the neighborhood, have come to a point into which great powers have to be engaged in the neighborhood, because these are the realities of the geopolitical turn in the Indo-Pacific and the Pacific Indian, which is what has been elucidated. And the most important part of his lecture has been the very important emphasis on non-security issues and how the de-securitization of India's foreign policy is vitally important, because de-securitization has its own narrative impact, and how that basically provides the transformative and the disruptive changes that could come into that. And de-securitization of India-Pakistan relations was a moot case in point, and the ambassador mentioned about the variety of challenges that India would face in this de-securitization agenda there. In conclusion, I would like to sum this whole lecture. The ambassador had provided a very succinct, very clear, candid, and an open mind lecture into which several ideas have been churned as a result of that. And I'm very sure that these ideas will be a very important feed for CPPR, even as it conceptualizes various projects in the coming days. And I want this report to be well elucidated, because this is going to be a kind of a charter for a research agenda for CPPR. India's neighborhood in the next decade, however I see, is going to be on the maritime front, even as India is going to have its two important advantages of the expanded extended economic zone, by which India's extended economic zone will go up to 4 million square kilometers, which is more than double of India's continental extent there. And having said that, the ambassador did also mention about the ancient voyages, and particularly I would like to mention the Chola naval expedition to Southeast Asia. And the Maritime Act East did come from this part of the country where I am located, which is the Coromandel coast, from which India began to access into East Asia and Southeast Asia and East Asia. That brought in a variety of issues like diaspora, maritime trade, cultural and idea dissemination, and we find that similar patterns of such dissemination going right now in the contemporary times. The Maritime Mandala, of course, which I provoked the ambassador to give his attention, did evoke a very serious answer, and I think that is going to be the churn, because India has to combine this Maritime Mandala along with the blue economy model for the next 2 decades of the 21st century, because that is going to be the harbinger of change, how India is going to look into it. India, as the ambassador mentioned, needs to focus on maritime connectivity, infrastructure development, public education, public health in an age of pandemics, because that is going to be the vital investment that India has to make into that. And as the ambassador rightly mentioned, the gridlock of India's continental geopolitics could be relieved if India could offset that with the geopolitical investments that India could make in the Maritime Act East policy, which is going to come into that. Not only that, India's northern sea route to the Arctic and India's interest in the Antarctic actually provide an extended India's maritime neighborhood, which well complements with what the ambassador had very eruditely and very elucidately has pointed out. Thank you, Ambassador, for this excellent lecture, and we really appreciate for the time taken and meticulously outlining these points. Thank you very much, and God bless.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. With this, we arrive at the conclusion of 17th quarterly lecture. Thank you all being here. Good night.